welcome to a special interview for VIT Today. We have with us today the former National Security Advisor, Foreign Secretary, and Indian Ambassador to China to deconstruct and make sense of the complex situation at the LAC. Over the course of this discussion, we aim to answer multiple questions hovering the situation at Galwan Valley and discuss what this means for the Indian-Chinese relationship. Mr. Shivshankar Menon, we're extremely glad to have you on our show and hope we have a fruitful discussion.
Thank you for asking me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Most welcome, sir. So starting things off, I wanted to start this interview by getting your take on the issue at our borders, especially with media reports coming out on a daily basis and speculations floating on every news channel. It's hard to differentiate between what to believe and what's extrapolated information or just an opinion piece given by a news channel. As an expert who's dealt with such scenarios before, what according to you should be believed by a viewer as concrete information and the real life situation at the LAC right now?
Well, I think it's natural that at this stage, when they're in the middle of a crisis, neither government is going to tell you all the details of what they are doing, what they are saying to each other, where they are on the border, all the tactical and the operational details. So I think we should accept, I know no more than you do. I read the same media that you do. And in the middle of a crisis, it's unfair to expect more also. I think you're absolutely right. There's a great deal of speculation because of the interest, and demand creates its own supply. So there's a lot of stories, lots of hype, lots of so-called expertise on these things. But on the tactical and the operational aspects, I think we must admit that we don't know very much. But what do we know then? What we know is that Chinese behavior on the border has changed this year. That in multiple places, they have, and this is according to official accounts by MEA, by the Indian Army, and by leaders, by our defense minister, for instance, they have tried to cross the LAC. They have brought up forces to the border and actually beefed up their presence on their side of the line also in multiple places where we might have different ideas of where the LAC is. And ultimately, we ended up in a clash. And for the first time, we lost the lives of our soldiers on the line in a clash with Chinese soldiers. Chinese soldiers also died. We don't know how many because China doesn't announce casualties. Even for the 1962 war, they've never announced casualties. It's only in history that was written in 1994, they announced how many Chinese PLA soldiers had died. But we know that 20 Indian soldiers, including a colonel, a very senior colonel, actually lost their lives in a clash. Now, this is serious because this has not happened since, nobody has lost their lives on this border in a clash between soldiers since 1975. And certainly, the last time there was anything that was bigger than this on scale was in 1967 near Natula. Now that's a very long time ago. So what conclusions can we draw from this? I'm very careful about saying, oh, the Chinese are here, this place, here, there. We don't know. But what we can assume is, A, Chinese behavior has changed. B, therefore, our reactions have to change. C, that we have to now try and assess this new situation and take steps to prevent it from getting worse in any way, and see how we can defend our interests. The minimum defensive posture is that we must not certainly lose any more territory. Already, China is occupying our territory in Aksai Chin and even elsewhere. So that's something that is the minimum defensive. And I think the government of India has made that quite clear. But both governments have also made it clear that they want to discuss this and climb down. There have been certain agreements about disengaging between the two when the militaries met at a very high level and when our foreign ministers spoke and thereafter among the diplomats. But they haven't done so yet. This has now lasted quite a long time. After all this started in April, and we're now about to enter July. So this has gone on a long time. So while both sides say they want to de-escalate, disengage, uh, I think we still are in the middle of a crisis, and this is not over yet by any means. So we need to be a little careful in jumping to big conclusions, as many of the people in the media do all the time.
Right. Sir, as a follow-up to this, and something that you touched upon in your answer as well, is the information dissemination on either side, right? How do you think it's going on the other side of the border, that is in China? Do you think the Chinese government is as open as the Indian government towards all this? And do you think they're telling their citizens, even if not the operational details, the basic amount of details that we are aware of, that there is a situation going on and so on? And while we have to respect that operational details are difficult to, of course, disseminate because of national security purposes, how do you think the information dissemination is in the Chinese side?
I don't think either side has disseminated much information. Both sides have been very careful in what they disseminate. What we are seeing on the Chinese side is actually a mirror image of what you see here. You see a lot of commentary. You see a lot of statements in the, how do I say it, the more extreme right-wing media, which in India also there are some TV channels which are busy talking about war and drawing all kinds of maps and all, telling you all about the terrible things. Global Times in China does the same. On social media, there has been commentary, but it is not on the Chinese side, but it is not a huge trending issue at all. Now, it's not as big a trending issue as it is, say, on Indian social media, on social media in India. But of course, China has its own set of social media, quite different from ours. Twitter and so on don't work in Twitter, Facebook. These are not available in China. They have a whole different set. Official media in China is much more careful and has stuck to the official line, which so far is not much comfort for us because it says that it's entirely India's fault, that India has crossed the line, and that what happened is India's fault, and therefore it's for India to take steps to de-escalate, etc. Now, you can say this is, each government will naturally justify what it has done. If you look at the MEA statements, they say the same thing, that China has done all this, and this is China's fault. We might say it better, maybe more diplomatically, maybe than some, but then say the Chinese Defense Ministry, but that's a minor difference. So at this stage in a crisis, I don't think it's the messaging is too different on both sides. Both sides clearly, the regime wants to make it clear to their own people that they are strong, they are firm, they're standing up for the nation, but they also don't want to put out so many details that it becomes impossible to actually climb down or to negotiate some kind of agreement. But I want to say one thing. We are now in this postmodern age where we are obsessed with discourse and narratives and story, but that's not the point here. The point here is the reality on the ground. And the reality on the ground is that this was peaceful for over 40 years, and it's not peaceful now. And I would rather, when analyzing a situation like this, watch their actions, not what they say. Because a lot of what they say is calculated for its effect on you. It's part of either trying to mislead or trying to assert or create psychological dominance. So, and that is true everywhere. I mean, in strategic communication, I'm not saying this is only true of the Chinese or only true of any other kinds of regimes, no. So given that, I'd be a little careful jumping to big conclusions based on what they write in the media. I mean, if the last thing that we can't assume what India will do from what's written in the Indian media. So why do we assume that other people's narratives and stories are any indication of what they actually think or what they will do? So I would urge a little caution there.
Right, sir. So this drifts us into a follow-up regarding this very topic you spoke about, the narrative basically that both the countries try to play and the psychological warfare that they try to implicate by playing that narrative. So taking that as context for a next question, do you think this is a strategic move on either government side to probably start a narrative of nationalism? And you've spoken about the nationalism being an extremely important tool for every government, or propaganda to distract the citizens from the mismanaged COVID crisis in both the countries, more specifically in China due to the geopolitical pressure that's implicated on them due to an delayed response that caused that added fuel to the fire, essentially making it more difficult for other countries to respond to the current crisis.
Well, it seems to me that it has to be a strategic move. Armies don't move when, somebody writes an article or popular opinion shifts. Armies move when governments move them. And certainly this kind of movement, what we've seen, moving forward, building up along the line in several places, crossing the line in several places as well. This doesn't happen just by accident or by oversight, or this only happens with high-level government decisions, actually, to do so. So when you say, is it strategic? It has to be. It cannot be. It's not some local tactical maneuver in all these places at the same time. So it is strategic, but speculating about how and why is a bit dangerous. I think what's happened, and this is purely a personal explanation. I mean, you can pick any number of explanations. My own feeling is that COVID accelerated a whole set of things that were already happening in our societies, in China, in India, but also in the global system, in the international community, and actually push them. You mentioned nationalism, for instance, the rise of ultra-nationalist leaders who project this image of being very strong national leaders. This has been going on since 2012. I mean, in China, Japan, India, everywhere you look. I mean, you look at Putin, you look, all the way until Trump in 2016. The reliance on nationalism, on ultranationalism for legitimacy, this also is common across these countries because since the 2008 economic crisis, their ability to deliver economic growth and goods, jobs, has actually declined. So what do you do when your performance legitimacy goes down? What do you rely on? You rely on emotion, on nationalism. You look for other charisma, personality cults. You start other things. If you can deliver consistent 8, 9, 10% growth, jobs to everybody, everybody's life is getting better, you don't need to do these other things. But after the global financial crisis and the world economic crisis, and certainly after COVID and the economic crash this has caused, you'll see even more of it. So it's actually accelerated. So many of these things, COVID did one more thing. It put every government under tremendous internal strain and stress. None of them knew how to deal with it, frankly, and nobody can say that they were very successful in doing it. I think in all these cases, everywhere around the world, and this is, again, irrespective of the nature of the regime, there are very few regimes which have the popular trust and confidence which enable them to deal with it at the community level. Taiwan, South Korea, a few places. Hong Kong did surprisingly well. Singapore did well in the beginning, had a wave come back. So my point is that they're under domestic stress also. So maybe, yes, China finds, the Chinese regime, Chinese leadership right now, finds this a useful diversion, a useful distraction. They're also under pressure from the US. You notice every government in the world is blaming somebody else for COVID and the mess that it's caused. China is blaming the US is blaming China, US and others are blaming WHO for not having done its job. Everybody is blaming somebody, not me. I'm not responsible, is their sort of attitude. So when they're under that kind of stress, maybe that's one reason. You can also, logically, there is the opposite explanation. China thinks, oh, the world's in chaos, everybody's distracted, now's the time to do something. But frankly, tactical military gains on a border with India and the attendant loss of reputation for reliability, tearing up the agreements or bringing into question all the agreements that she has signed with India, which is what all this amounts to. Is that really a trade-off? Is it worth it? It's very hard to see. So I tend to the first explanation, that this is a useful distraction. There are local military factors also, I'm sure, which have led to it. But more than that, the strategic thing is that COVID has actually accelerated various trends, created tensions internally. Many of these are now being externalized, and they're looking for a distraction. Maybe that's part of it. Against that, of course, there are people who look for other, they say, signaling or messaging, or they're telling you not to get close to the US, don't do this. Frankly, if this is messaging, it is most inefficient. Because why are we all guessing what the message is? I mean, there's a very simple way. If they wanted to message and tell you something, they can stand up and say so. I mean, you know, somebody says, oh, it's because of what we did when we made Ladakh into a union territory. The Chinese have never said that. And the Chinese are not shy about telling you what they think. I find it's only Indians or Westerners or others who say this. But the Chinese have never said this. And why shouldn't they say it? Chinese are not shy about what they say. I mean, they're quite willing to admit that they have now charged 2 Canadians after holding them for 2 years as hostages for Canada's behavior with the daughter of the founder of Huawei. And they've made it quite clear in public that if you release her, we will release these 2. And that's not, you know, normal behavior among states. So I don't think this is about messaging. This is about local tactical military gains, about which, as I said, we know very little at this stage. And it's about the larger strategic picture that I think their own internal dynamics, which actually drives them in this direction.
Right. So bringing this back home a little, do you think the same principle of, say, driving a narrative towards shifting away from this mismanagement of a COVID crisis and the upcoming recession that is almost evidently going to happen, right? So do you think the same narrative applies to, or the same principle applies to the Indian government as well? Obviously, no government wants to be blamed for the crisis at hand that happened, the lockdown and everything else. So do you think the same principle of guiding the narrative towards an almost ultra-nationalistic view applies here?
You know, the Indian government's reaction, if you notice, in the beginning was very careful. And the Indian government was relatively silent compared to what the Chinese were doing, because the Chinese initiated this. So they had a story ready, they were busy pushing. In the last week or so, you have heard much clearer statements from the Indian government. And something of what you said is happening. There has been a perceptible hardening in what the Indian government is saying. There are calculated leaks about retaliation, that we have given as good as we got, that we have stood up, you know, et cetera, et cetera. But both sides have a problem here. They don't know how this is going to end. And they don't want to provoke an end which actually results in their losing face. They don't want to end up with a defeat which then makes them look really stupid. Both sides. So now you're in the stage where they are negotiating, they are talking to each other. In fact, they're saying the diplomats will talk every week, I think. But, and they will still be a little careful in what they say in public. But you and I don't know what they're saying to each other at the table, what they are demanding, what exactly they want. So I'd be a little cautious about jumping to some big conclusions. But certainly you have seen attempts by politicians on both sides to use this to say, don't worry, we're standing up, we will win this battle, etc., you know, to rouse emotions and to be on the right side of those emotions. And I think that is something that is inevitable.
Right, sir. So, concluding this line of debate that we had till now, in conclusion, do you believe that the government's response has been adequate or apt, in the sense that initially, as you said, they were silent, and then there was this overly criticized media response, or the press statement given by the Prime Minister. Do you believe that the Indian government has responded adequately enough to the situation?
When we don't know what exactly has happened on the ground, you can't say whether it's adequate or not. What I can say is that I think they could have done a better job of strategic communication with their own people. And the example I like to use is Kargil, where there were daily briefings, and both the army and MEA, the MEA spokesman and somebody from the army, used to come before the cameras and say, this is what's happened, this is our point of view, this is what we think. They didn't give away details. They didn't, give away any secrets, anything, but it reassured and calmed the nation. And people then, at least they felt there's clear messaging coming. And it also strengthens your negotiating hand with the other side, in this case with China, because it makes clear to them what Indian public opinion can, will, and where your red lines are. So frankly, I think that there could have been a better job done on strategic communication to our own people. One reason why there's so much speculation in the media, such contradictory stories, is because this space has been left unoccupied. And you don't have an authoritative voice coming out from the government. And I think that's the one area. But otherwise, I think it's too early to say whether it was adequate. The time for, postmortems, for studying and then drawing lessons, improving, all that I think is after the crisis, as we did after Kargil. When there was first a committee that looked into it, headed by Mr. K. Subramaniam, and then a group of ministers who looked at their recommendations, and most of those recommendations were acted on.
Right. So we wanted to discuss your book a bit. So in the first chapter of your book, The Choices, you spoke a bit about your role while negotiating with the Chinese government. And ironically, a similar internally unstable situation, right? What parallels can you draw with the situation then, when you were the ambassador and the joint secretary in the Indian government, and the situation right now? And how does your new book encompass that parallel and encompass that change in geopolitics?
My new book is very different. My new book is actually, unlike Choices, which looked at individual cases and analyzed, 5 separate issues and how we dealt with them. One was the Border Peace and Tranquility Agreement of 1993 with the Chinese, as you said. The new book actually looks at India and Asian geopolitics from the inception, from 47, and then looks in the last 5 chapters at the present situation, in which, of course, India-China relations is one big chapter, but it's a more broad, it's not a case study of one issue and how we looked at it, how they looked at it, and how we then managed to deal with it, how I think we should deal with it. My own sense is, yes, there might be apparent parallels with 1989-92 today from China's point of view. There is internal stress, but it's not internal stress of the same order as the Tiananmen incident and the killings. It wasn't that kind of uprising in the streets. That's not what's going on. But there is much more stress from the US. In 1989-90, as they saw the Soviet Union collapsing, there was an assumption that the US would now come to try regime change in China, the last remaining big communist power left in the world, now that the Soviet Union had been toppled. Today, but China-US relations actually stabilized quite quickly, thanks to President Bush, the father of the President Bush who we did the nuclear deal with, and thanks to Deng Xiaoping, who was still alive. Today, US-China relations are much more fraught than they were then. So yes, there are some parallels, but they're different. But the biggest difference, I think, is that China today is part of the world. China is much more dependent on the outside world, on the world economy. than she was in 1989-92 during that period. And of course, China has risen. China today has power that she didn't have. When we did the Border Peace and Tranquility Agreement the years before, 1988, when we did the basic understanding, our GDPs were roughly the same, India and China. Today, China is more than 4 times bigger than India in terms of GDP. Her defense budget is anywhere up to 5 times more than India's every year. And China has accumulated tremendous power. She is an economic superpower. There's no question. It's not that India has done badly. It's just that China has done even better than India did during this period. So when you look at that, today you're talking about a very different situation. Now, I don't want to frighten people because to my mind, the peace has held on the border because the effective balance on the border is not as bad as some comparison of GDP or of defense budgets might suggest. I mean, this might be 4 or 5, but because there's been effective balance on the border, both sides can embarrass each other. Therefore, the peace has held for over 40 years. But now the peace is broken. And I think it's time for us to start analyzing why has it been broken? Has the effective balance on the border shifted? Or does China think the balance has shifted when it hasn't shifted? It's possible, because this is a matter of perception here. So I think that's something we need to look at very carefully and study and see where we're going. And that's something that it's not something you can just suddenly, make a quick calculus and figure that out. That's something serious the government needs to do for itself. Look at it and then derive policy implications from that accordingly.
So continuing from where we left off, now we can best describe India's long-standing history with China. China, at least in terms of diplomatic relations, is complicated, right? Because of the tumultuous relations that we had in the past. So how do you think this situation affects the long-term diplomatic relations that we have with China? Or do you think this is just one under the belt of the twists and turns that it's taken?
Well, I think certainly that there's no going back in these things. And that India-China relations will be more adversarial than they have been in the recent past for the last 30 years. But India-China relations, if you look at the overall 70 plus years since China, the People's Republic of China was founded in 49, then India-China relations have known everything from Hindi-Chini Bhai to war in 62, to very cold peace, to trading where China became our biggest trading partner. And then today is still our biggest trading partner in goods. There are about 23,000 Indian students who study in China. So it's a very mixed relationship. And I think we have come to the stage where it includes elements of cooperation, elements of competition, and we have big differences. Boundary dispute obviously is one of them, but there are other issues also on which we differ. And so for me, the prospect after this, especially because what China has done has actually questioned the agreements that we had and her willingness to implement existing agreements. So then we will both be much more cautious going forward. We will hedge, we will balance, we will make sure that we can't be surprised in the future. And given that, therefore, the adversarial elements in the relationship will be much stronger than they have been in the recent past. Where it can go, I can't say, because it depends on how we resolve this crisis. And that's not clear at all. Whether we are resolving, how we resolve, none of that is clear at this moment. It's still too early to say.
Right, sir. So you spoke about how China has grown much more as a country that India has in terms of GDP, spent military budget, etc. If I was to make a counter argument to that, saying that geopolitically India has an upper hand because we are now going to be a member of the UN Security Council, There's an anti-China rhetoric from the West. So we have a stronger ally in the West. At the same time, there has been reports of dissent in the top hierarchy of the Chinese government, in the sense that the way the Hong Kong situation was handled, or the way Taiwan is being handled currently, do you think that these arguments still hold certain amount of standing or leverage for the Indian side of the table when it comes to negotiating with the Chinese?
I think we have to be careful about drawing conclusions across the board and lumping everything together. If the US is yelling at China, it doesn't solve our problem in Galwan. That's a problem that we have to solve ourselves. Nobody else is going to solve it for you. No matter how friendly they are, how much of your friend they are. That's something, that border, you have to maintain the balance. You have to defend your own territory. That's something you have to do. Nobody else can do that for you. No amount of external alliances and so on. Now, you might say logically that if China is otherwise distracted, for instance, her relationship with the US is very tense, why is she also picking fights with other people like India? Why is she also on the assertive in the South China Sea? Why is she passing a law which makes Hong Kong, which actually tears up the agreement on Hong Kong, reduces Hong Kong's autonomy actually by imposing Chinese security on it? Why is she assertive? Why is she sending submarines around the Senkakus in the East China Sea? So it doesn't follow that because China's situation in one or other place is difficult. I think the calculus really in Beijing, the number one priority for them is regime survival and stability. I think that is what really counts. Not does it help us in our dealings with the Americans or does it help us in Hong Kong and so on. And many of these are hot button issues for the Chinese leadership in Chinese opinion. After all, what is the legitimacy of the People's Republic of China? Mao Zedong said, China has stood up, right? Deng Xiaoping made China prosperous, taught them how to grow. But that growth has slowed now. And if they are seen as either having lost territory or lost control of Hong Kong, as these protests seem to suggest, or that unification with Taiwan is never going to happen. And don't forget, these are all now territorial issues, every one of them, whether it's the maritime disputes in the East China Sea, South China Sea. China talks of it as a territorial sea. On all these, there's an extreme sensitivity on Chinese sovereignty and an extreme sensitivity on the part of the regime as being seen as being soft somehow on this. So for me, it's not obvious, therefore, that you can use, say, naval pressure somewhere else or China's bad relations with Japan, with the US, with others, to actually translate into your being able to deal with this extreme sensitivity on territory, on sovereignty, and frankly, we have the same. I mean, let's admit it. The loss of territory is really the worst possible thing for any government to have to admit to its people. Why did the Prime Minister of India, first thing he said was, they haven't come into our territory and they're not sitting on our territory, we haven't lost anything. I mean, that is the most sensitive point. I mean, he was talking about Galwan and then it became a big argument, but that's not the point. Territory for either side is very difficult to. So I'm a bit, I'm cautious about drawing linkages. Yes, you do all these other things, but you do these other things, work with partners, build coalitions in order to strengthen India. That you have to do. But not in order to solve the immediate problem on the border. That you have to do yourself. You strengthen India in order to be able to do that yourself. And you work with others to strengthen India, to grow the economy, to grow your military strength, etc. So the way I see it, actually, you're dealing with a much more complex set of issues and problems.
Right. And adding on to your description of how China has taken this action forward, and in some previous interviews where you mentioned that the Chinese have been aggressive, or rather unusual for them to take such an approach towards India. Do you think it's time for India to consider changing its strategy towards China as well? Because so far we've been reactive at best. Do you think it's time for us to start the debate on maybe being proactive, even if not at the border, maybe using soft power to be more proactive against China in order to tackle this issue?
No, I think there's no question. When Chinese behavior changes, we have to analyze it, but we also need to change our behavior. We will. And we have done so in the past. I mean, this is not the first time that this has happened. We have changed. To say that we've been only proactive, reactive is not true. But, these are not things that governments announce about what they're doing. The other side knows what they're doing. After all, if you look at the real changes in the balance on the border, you look at the building out of infrastructure over the last 20 years on our border, and slowly closing the gap with China, because China did that much earlier. That's not reactive. That is actually proactive, much of what we've done. This new road that goes all the way to DBO, which the Chinese actions in Galwan and Depsang seem to be reacting to. These are actions that we decided and have taken. So yes, we must review what we do. We need to study what's happened, learn lessons, and change what we do. And I think Keynes put it best. So when somebody said, oh, you're being inconsistent, 5 years ago you said something else, now you're saying this. He said, look, when the facts change, I change my mind. What do you do? And which is, I think, the right attitude. If the facts have changed, circumstances have changed, certainly the global context within which India-China relations are managed has changed. Chinese behavior has changed. Certainly we should review what we do and change what we do also.
Right, sir. So concluding this amazing discussion we had, in an article to the Brookings Institute in 2019, he outlined an important reform for the Indian institutions to undertake in order for us to achieve our goals for 2024. One of the important ones being, an important aspect of that article being aligning our foreign economic policies to our political agendas and ambitions, at the same time building new frameworks with our relationship with China and the United States of America. Seeing that the Galwan incident that happened being an increasingly important incident in terms of defining our geopolitical relation with China, do you think that our vision to achieve the goals, as you stated in the article in 2024, still stand? Or do you think that that is something completely unfeasible, also considering the COVID crisis, that the government should focus on probably more doable and feasible agendas for 2024?
Well, it seems to me that COVID actually knocked everybody's plans out of the window. Whether it was the China dream, or whether it's make China, America great again, or whether it's our plans for 2024, or I think COVID really has pushed everybody on the back foot. Nobody's quite sure when we can get back on track or whether we can get back on track for those plans. So that, I think, has already happened. But I think what I was trying to look at was not so much what changes do we need to make just to achieve immediate targets, but what do we need to make if we want to transform India into, and if we want to take care of India's interests, which is basically the interest of our people in a much better life, in a secure life, a prosperous life where every Indian can achieve their potential, can try, at least has the opportunity to achieve their potential. Now that, for me, for that, there are certain things that we need to do. We cannot shut ourselves off from the world. We need the world. We have to engage with the world. So when we say self-reliance, it makes sense. I mean, we've spoken of self-reliance since Jawaharlal Nehru's days. But how autarkic do we want to be? How self-reliant? After all, we don't have energy. We depend on the world for energy. We don't have non-ferrous metals. We depend on the world for that. We don't have technology. And we even import capital, though less so today than we did, say, in the 60s or 70s. Now, given these, but we have strengths. We have strengths in our people, and we have other strengths that we have. We have location. We have a whole series of other strengths. Now, you need to use your comparative advantage, but given our situation, we cannot just grow India, make it prosperous and secure entirely on its own today. And we have to recognize that. In order to do that, to engage with the world, therefore, you can't run one kind of economic policy which heads in an opposite direction from political and military engagement. When I say engagement, doesn't only mean political relations and military relations or defense and security. And if you don't trade with them, if you don't open your economy to them, they will not open their economies to you. You can't run away from the RCEP, from the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, this world's biggest free trade area, which is being finalized. After having negotiated for 8 years, you can't run away from it, raise your customs duties for 4 years, and then expect other people to still trade and deal with you, or to take you seriously when you then say, no, but I'll work very closely with you politically and militarily. I mean, they say you're being protectionist, one, but here, when it suits you, you come to us. So frankly, you need an integrated view of where you are. And that's what my next book, which will come out now, I think only in January, because of COVID and all this, that actually argues for a strategy of engagement and makes the argument that given our geography, our history, our resource endowment, and where we are today, our levels of development, there is no getting away from the world. And we actually need to be more active in the world, especially in the Indian subcontinent, but also in the whole Indian Ocean region and beyond that on global issues.
Right, sir. So I'm so sorry, but I just wanted to follow up on one small point you made about reacting opposite to what your political ambition is, right? So, like for example, India's statement, the Prime Minister and the Home Minister statement on say implying a make in India, or let's say using Indian products. That's polar opposite to, as you stated, the liberalized and the open economy we're going towards. So in conclusion, what essentially my question hints towards is, do you think the government is trying for a propaganda victory, or in opposition to a real victory, just to make their people feel that, okay guys, we have won, but in the true essence, it's not won anything, it's just trying to make sure that the people are calm?
I can't answer that. Only the government can answer that. You're asking me what is the government trying to do? They have to tell you. I can't guess their mind. I can't read their mind. I've been far away from government for the last 6 years. So.
Right, sir. Okay, then I think with that, we'd like to conclude our interview. It was great speaking to you, sir. We really appreciate you interviewing for us, and we hope we can do this again at a better time and a better day. So thank you so much for joining us today at VIT Today.
Thank you
so much.
Thank you very much. All the best. Thanks.
All right, sir. Have a great day. Bye-bye.
You too.